In the winter of 1976, through the grey of a divided Berlin, a man walked alone beside the wall, his breath vanishing into the cold air above a city of watchtowers and silence. From a bare apartment on Hauptstrasse, with no telephone to ring and no escape but his own reflection, he stared out at a world that had once screamed his name. He was one of the most colossal rock stars on the planet, a creature of glitter and chaos, and he was hiding here, vanishing into the shadow of a concrete scar. From this hollowed-out place, he would forge a triptych of masterpiece albums that changed everything. Yet the real mystery is not the music he made, but the desperate fracture that drove him there. This is the story of David Bowie and the dark, unfinished road he walked to the edge of his own destruction. By 1975, David Bowie had achieved everything a rock star could dream of, and it was devouring him alive. He was living in Los Angeles, a city that ran on excess, perched at the absolute summit of fame, yet he was starving himself on a diet of milk and red peppers. His cocaine intake was so ferocious that his weight collapsed to around 45 kilograms, and his paranoia grew so vast it filled every room he walked into. The irony is brutal. He had conquered America with the plastic soul of young Americans, but the city of Mulholland Drive and Sunset Strip had become a haunted house where demons whispered in the hills. In 2001, he told Mojo magazine that he had been almost certainly out of my mind in LA and that he harbored suicidal thoughts. Berlin, he said, was the only place where he didn't dare think about it anymore because the city was cold and real as a knife. But why would a man convinced he was losing his mind choose the most divided city in Europe? The answer is stranger than mere geography. Brian Eno later recalled that Bowie believed was being tormented by supernatural forces in California, and that he saw Berlin as an atheist city, a place stripped of myth and magic, where those dark entities could not follow him. He was not just fleeing a place. He was fleeing a metaphysical battleground. Of course, his escape was not a clean break. Contrary to the popular myth of a direct flight into the German fog, Bowie actually landed in Paris with Iggy Pop in March of 1976, hiding there for months. He only moved on once he realized that the French capital was too small, too watchful. He wanted somewhere nobody knew his name, and Berlin, divided by a wall and surrounded by silence, promised exactly that. At that moment, standing in a foreign city with his friend Iggy, the man who had once been the Thin White Duke was reduced to a ghost. He had not merely escaped the city of angels, he had abandoned the person he had become there. The question that follows is unshakable. What kind of nightmare follows a man across an ocean? The concrete air of Paris did nothing to settle his nerves. Every cafe mirror reflected a gaunt figure he barely recognized, cheekbones sharp enough to cut glass, eyes sunk deep into bruised sockets. He wore long coats and wide-brimmed hats, not as fashion but as armor, and still the French press found him, snapping photographs that captured a man who looked like his own death mask. Iggy later said that Bowie moved through those months like a sleepwalker, existing in a state of half-consciousness, his body present but his mind still trapped in the Santa Monica canyons, where shadows played tricks on him at 3 in the morning. They spent their days in cheap hotel rooms, the radiators clanking like arthritic bones, the wallpaper peeling in strips that reminded Bowie of dead skin. He would sit by the window for hours, counting the pigeons on the rooftops, tracing the same crack in the ceiling with his finger until it became a ritual. The cocaine had ravaged his nasal passages so thoroughly that he could taste blood at the back of his throat whenever he breathed too deeply, and the only food he could stomach was a bowl of cold rice and a handful of chili peppers. The heat a reminder that he was still alive. His hands trembled constantly, not from withdrawal but from something deeper, a fine tremor that seemed to originate in his very soul. One afternoon, in late April, Iggy found him on the bathroom floor, muttering about the black dog that had been following him down the Boulevard Saint-Germain. There was no dog, of course, but Bowie's eyes were wide with genuine terror, and his skin was pale as candle wax. It was then that Iggy realized his friend had crossed some invisible line, that the man who had once crafted personas with surgical precision could no longer distinguish between the mask and the face beneath. Bowie himself would later admit that he spent those months waiting for the floor to open up and swallow me. His paranoia so acute that he checked his food for poison, his mail for hexes, his phone line for taps. The decision to leave Paris came when a fan recognized him at a cafe and approached, not aggressively, but with a kind of reverence that finally crushed him. The interaction was innocuous, no more than a handshake and an autograph, but Bowie fled the establishment like a man escaping a burning building. He understood then that Paris was merely Los Angeles with better architecture, a city where his fame would always hunt him down. Sitting in the back of a taxi, watching the streetlights blur into trails of amber, he turned to Iggy and said, "I need a place where no one knows me. A place that is cold and grey and real." Berlin, that divided and wounded city, rose in his mind like a memory from a previous life, and he knew with sudden clarity that this was where he had to go. West Berlin in 1976 was not a sanctuary. It was a pressure cooker, and David Bowie walked straight into it with his wounds still open. The German Federal Arc, drawing on records from those years, paint a portrait of a city that matched his inner turmoil. Unemployment hovered around 3.5%, while the rate of heroin addiction among people aged 15 to 25 stood at 2%, the highest in all of Europe. Bowie himself would later describe this environment as an island of controlled despair, a phrase that captures the strange, grim energy of a place where hopelessness had become a kind of civic institution. What did a man fleeing his own destruction do inside such a landscape? He did not recover. He did not rest. Iggy Pop, who shared those cramped, chaotic rooms with him, recorded in his memoir a night that reveals the obsessive edge of Bowie's habits. 7 cups of black coffee, 3 apples, and then, the next morning, a vocal take for Heroes that Iggy described as hoarse and exhausted, like a dead man brought back to life. This was not the behavior of someone healing. It was the behavior of someone running on fumes, pushing a body that had already been hollowed out by cocaine and paranoia in Los Angeles. The strangest detail, though, was the diary. Iggy noted that Bowie never spoke of demons aloud in Berlin, yet he kept a journal filled with dreams and what he called space entities. That notebook stayed hidden, a private ledger of a mind still fraying at the edges. And here is where the image of the reclusive genius begins to crack open. The man who moved to number 155 Hauptstrasse in Schöneberg, who deliberately refused to install a telephone just to sever himself from fame, was not serene. He was a ghost in a furnished room, trying to outrun something that lived inside him. Why does any of this matter beyond the scandal of it? Because Berlin did not cure him overnight, and that is precisely the point. The city gave him no comfort, only space, cold, indifferent, and vast enough to let his collapse happen in private. But was that space truly empty? The streets of Schöneberg at night, the dim light of a kneipe, the sound of a jungle club leaking music onto the pavement, all of it formed a backdrop against which Bowie could finally hear his own thoughts without the roar of an audience. He was still sick. He was still haunted. Yet the very bleakness of his surroundings, the refusal of the city to cosset him, forced a confrontation he had spent years avoiding. One evening in 1977, after too much to drink, Bowie and Iggy wandered the streets and stumbled upon a homeless man singing an old German folk song. There was no grand revelation, no dramatic epiphany, but the melody lodged itself in Bowie's memory, and not long after, it surfaced as the opening of Warschauer. That is what Berlin offered him, not healing but material, not peace but the raw, ugly friction of life. In his isolation and desperation, something new had begun to stir. A voice that would soon shape the most radical music of his career, but only after he had let the old one die completely. By the autumn of 1976, the man who had once filled stadiums had become a ghost in plain sight, pedaling a bicycle along the grey spine of the wall in the pale Berlin morning. The photographer Andrew Kent, who spent weeks trailing him, once described watching Bowie stop dead at a stretch of graffiti, his face breaking into a smile like a child at the freshly painted words, "Bowie ist gut." And in that moment, Kent realized the city had quietly adopted its strangest resident. Berlin did not treat him like a god, which was exactly the point, and he responded by becoming the most ordinary man in the neighborhood. A thin figure in a cloth cap who bought his own vegetables and nodded at the old women walking their dogs. Bowie preferred the raw edges of the city, and his favorite territory was Kreuzberg, a district of crumbling facades and Turkish grocers that still carried the scars of the war. He told Andrew Kent that the area had an energetic rawness of the outskirts, a phrase that captured why he kept returning to its broken pavements, and he would spend hours weaving through its back streets on his bicycle, absorbing the noise and the decay. The man who had worn lightning bolts on his face now wanted nothing more than to be indistinguishable from the other pale, tired men waiting for the tram, and in Kreuzberg no one asked him for an autograph. The details of his routine have been pieced together by neighbors and shopkeepers who did not realize until years later who their quiet customer had been. Every Monday, without fail, he walked into the Friedenau barbershop, where the barber Jürgen later recalled that his client never said much, but always left a tip double the usual amount. A small act of generosity that felt almost like an apology for existing. And at the Buchhandlung am Wittenbergplatz, the bookseller would watch him browse for an hour without speaking, his hands moving reverently over volumes on the occult and nihilism, titles that would later surface in the dark currents of Station to Station, as the shop owner told the Berliner Zeitung in 2016. What emerged from his apartment, when researchers were finally allowed access, was the portrait of a man far more intellectual than the public had ever understood. The Bowie archive catalogued roughly 3,000 books from his Berlin library, and among the marginalia, they found his annotations on class struggle, fascism, and Eastern philosophy, a startling reminder that beneath the glitter and the androgyny lived a restless student of the world. So who was the real David Bowie in those years, the sequined alien or the quiet reader with the library card? And how did he hold both selves together without shattering? For anyone who wants to walk the same streets, the path is well marked now, and you can trace his daily circuit in a few unhurried hours. Start at Nollendorfplatz station in Schöneberg, the hub where he stepped off the U-Bahn nearly every day, then make your way to 155 Hauptstrasse, the apartment building where he lived without a telephone, and pause outside because it is still a private home. From there, take the U-Bahn to Cottbusser Tor and walk 10 minutes to the old Hansa studio at Kothaner Strasse 38. The hall where he conjured his trilogy, and end your pilgrimage at the Zwiebelfisch Café near Savigniplatz, nursing a cough while you wonder what it felt like to be him. Somewhere in that loop, between the barbershop and the bookshop, the alien finally shed his skin, and a man named David Jones walked out into the light. There is a strange comfort in knowing that a legend so vast could find peace in such small rituals, and an even stranger one in realizing that the quietest chapter of his life was the one that saved him. There was a strange magic in the way David Bowie pulled Iggy Pop back from the edge, and in doing so, found his own footing. The two men, both shattered in their own ways, had landed in Berlin with little more than each other and a shared history of self-destruction. Bowie, the man who had supposedly fled the demons of Los Angeles, now took on the role of a caretaker, producing 2 albums for his friend that would become pillars of their respective careers. They recorded The Idiot and Lust for Life together across Berlin and France, and as Paul Trinker documented in his biography Iggy Pop, Open Up and Bleed, Bowie acted as the mentor who practically dragged Iggy away from the brink of suicide. Their days were not solely spent in the studio, though. They often wandered to Künstlerhaus Bethanien, an art center in Kreuzberg that buzzed with an alternative energy, a stark contrast to the polished excess they had left behind. It was there, among painters and performance artists, that Bowie found his visual senses reawakened. And Iggy, the raw nerve of rock, found a place where his chaos was not just tolerated but celebrated. The environment was less about recovery and more about a shared, almost desperate, re-engagement with the world. The Bowie Archive noted this period in 2018 as crucial for this artistic opening, a time when the two fed off the city's disaffected creativity like a lifeline. But the public image of Bowie as a solitary, haunted figure in a cold apartment is only half the story. The truth, as his longtime friend and artist Derek Boshier revealed to The Guardian in 2016, was far more social. Bowie had a close-knit circle that included Boshier, video director David Mallet, and artist George Underwood. They would gather for beers at a bar called Zwiebelfisch in Savigniplatz nearly every Thursday night. The image of him as a lonely genius is a myth. He was a man in a community, albeit a small and trusted one, finding normalcy in the company of friends who knew him before the fame and who did not care for the personas he wore on stage. Was this the real cure then? Not the isolation, but the brotherhood. It was in his friendship with Iggy that this dynamic played out with the most intensity. By helping to save Iggy, Bowie was, in a very real sense, trying to save himself. Their mutual need created a powerful bond that was less about guiding and more about walking alongside each other through the wreckage of their former lives. Berlin was not just where David Bowie found himself, it was where he discovered the profound necessity of being needed, a purpose that proved more stabilizing than any therapy. That realization, born out of a chaotic, desperate friendship, was a foundation for the next great chapter of his life. There, in the flickering half-light of a Berlin recording studio, the roles blurred. Iggy would arrive with bloodshot eyes and a head full of static, and Bowie, with a steady hand and an almost parental patience, would coax melodies from Iggy's fractured poetry. They were listening to Iggy's actual heartbeat sped up through a stethoscope for the drums of Lust for Life. That primal pounding rhythm was the sound of a man who was, against all odds, still alive. It was a raw tactile process. Bowie's hand would hover over the mixing board, adjusting the treble, then he'd turn to Iggy, who was wrapped in a shabby coat despite the stuffy booth, and say, "Again, Jim. This time, spit it out like you mean to bite someone." He pushed Iggy to confront his demons directly in the lines, to channel the urge to self-destruct into the raw power of his performance. This wasn't charity, it was a life raft constructed from shared desperation, and Bowie was holding his breath right alongside his friend, praying the wood would hold. Beyond the album sessions, they were often at Künstlerhaus Bethanien in Kreuzberg, surrounded by anarchic sculptures and avant-garde film projections. The air smelled of turpentine, dust, and stale cigarette smoke, a sensory cocktail that fired new synapses in Bowie's brain. Watching Iggy engage with a massive chaotic canvas, Bowie realized that the feeling he chased was not a personal salvation but a shared, collective creation. The question of what this meant for his own art melted away in the presence of the art itself. He had been carrying the weight of Los Angeles like a coat made of wet sand, but the moment he stepped into the Hansa studio by the wall, something in him began to shift. The Berlin Trilogy, as the world would later call it, was never planned as a trilogy at all. Low, released in 1977, Heroes later that same year, and Lodger in 1979 were all recorded mostly in that old hall near the wall, a building that had once been a ballroom for Nazi officers and now smelled of cold stone and dead air. The Guardian noted in 2016 that this was where Bowie chose to rebuild himself, track by track, in a city that had every reason to feel like the end of the world. Brian Eno was the first to notice what Bowie was doing with his notebook. The producer watched him write random phrases on sheets of paper, cut them into strips with scissors, and then arrange those fragments into lyrics on the floor of the studio, a method Eno later described as a way to escape the shadow of yourself. Eno told The Guardian about the night he sat at a synth pad, fiddling with a new chord progression, and Bowie stayed silent for 20 minutes, just listening. Then he said, "Keep going, Brian, I am hearing the future." That moment, Eno recalled, was the seed of Low. How do you explain a man who treated chaos as a collaborator rather than an enemy? The album's opening track, Warszawa, began with a Polish prayer that Bowie sang like a voice from an oppressed land, and critics read it as a direct reflection of the city split down the middle. He had heard that melody somewhere in his travels, and he turned it into something that felt ancient and broken, a hymn for a walled-off world. AllMusic noted in 2017 that the song captured the very texture of Berlin, the grey mornings, the silence between gunshots, the waiting that never ended. It was not a hit. It was something far more valuable. Even the visuals were ahead of their time. Bowie and designer Derek Boshier shot an 8mm film for Heroes using rapid cut editing, a technique the British Film Institute later dated as a full decade ahead of mainstream music video culture. In 1979, that approach made no sense commercially, and that was precisely the point. The man who had once chased fame with such hunger now wanted to make things that could not be easily consumed. Then Eno watched him arrange the cut-up lyrics again, and he realized that the technique was not about hiding meaning, but about freeing it. You take every phrase you fear, every line you would never dare to sing, and you let the scissors decide what comes next. What other method could have turned a nervous breakdown into a record called Low? Take those 5 steps yourself when the burnout hits. First, name your own Los Angeles, the thing that drains you, and spend 30 minutes writing it down. Second, change your living space for a season, even if it is just a week in a different neighborhood. Third, build a 90-day detox ritual that cuts out one addictive habit and replaces it with a morning walk. Fourth, start a project so strange that no one around you understands it. Finally, find your own Brian Eno, the person who will sit in silence with you for 20 minutes while you search for the future. He was not looking for a new sound. He was looking for a way to survive. They called the Hansa studio the Hall by the Wall, and for good reason. It sat just a couple of 100 feet from the Berlin Wall, a cavernous old building that had somehow survived the war, and now served as a strange, echoing home for some of the most important music of the decade. By the summer of 1977, David Bowie was already deep into what would become the first piece of his famed trilogy with Low, an album that puzzled as much as it thrilled. But it was the follow-up that would crystallize the entire Berlin experience into a single unforgettable anthem. The story of how Heroes came to be is part studio legend, part secret history, and it begins with a kiss that Bowie saw through a window. Producer Tony Visconti was in the control room when he noticed a woman he knew, a backing vocalist named Antonia Maas, walking along the death strip with her young daughter. Visconti stepped outside to greet her and, in a moment of spontaneous affection, kissed her. The soldiers in the watchtower above them looked down, rifles slung, and did nothing. Bowie watched the entire scene unfold and was electrified by the defiance of it all, the small human gesture played out against the ultimate symbol of division. He asked Visconti for permission to write a song about it, and the producer, somewhat bemused, said yes. What emerged from that moment was a track built on tension and longing, a love song set against the impossible odds of a divided city. The recording process was as unconventional as the inspiration. In July 1978, Bowie stood in a studio positioned just 91 meters from the wall, singing his vocal take from only a few centimeters away from the microphone. This close miking technique, a deliberate choice, produced a strange, intimate quality in his voice, a sense of someone whispering desperately right into your ear while the world outside remains cold and distant. The result was a song that felt both personal and monumental, a delicate melody wrapped in layers of industrial grit. The Berlin Wall itself, a structure that had been erected on August 13, 1961, and would not fall until November 9, 1989, was more than just a backdrop. It was the very air Bowie breathed during his time in the city. He had seen it every day from his apartment window, a 3.5-meter high concrete scar stretching 155 kilometers around the western half of the city. It was the visible physical manifestation of the Cold War's anxiety, and he channeled that anxiety directly into his art. But where Heroes was a soaring, defiant cry, the album that closed the trilogy was a quieter, stranger beast. Lodger, released in 1979, never quite achieved the legendary status of its predecessors. It was a record that felt more like a collection of experiments than a unified statement. A travelogue of sounds that sampled musical ideas from around the globe. Bowie himself seemed ready to move on. He left Berlin in 1979, relocating to New York and declaring that the Berlin chapter was firmly closed. Yet the city never entirely released its hold on him. He kept an apartment there for the rest of his life, a quiet sanctuary that he would return to again and again, a place that held the ghost of the man he had been and the blueprint of the man he was becoming. For the listener who wants to understand this period, building a personal recovery album can be a powerful exercise. First, choose a rock persona you admire, someone like Bowie or Iggy Pop, whose creative rebirth was tied to a specific place. Second, find the trilogy of work they created during their healing phase, the records that mark the transformation. Third, keep a journal that responds to each song, noting the emotions and memories they surface. Fourth, design your own personal Berlin trip. Not a literal pilgrimage, but a physical or mental space dedicated to introspection and rebuilding. Finally, after 30 days of immersion, mark the end of the cycle with a small, private performance, a celebration of the distance you have traveled. It is a way of making the myth tangible, of turning someone else's masterpiece into a map for your own survival. Brian Eno, the man who had once heard the future in a Berlin studio, was there to witness Bowie reach his peak. But even he understood that the magic of that moment was never meant to last forever. The deeper answer to why Bowie chose Berlin lies buried in family grief and a haunted mind. His half-brother Terry Burns was diagnosed with schizophrenia in 1967, a shadow that loomed over Bowie's life and pushed him toward the city's isolating quiet. Terry, who had been committed to psychiatric hospitals, would later take his own life in 1985, and Berlin offered Bowie a geographical escape from that relentless familial pressure. It was a place where he could be unreachable, a stranger in a divided metropolis that asked nothing of him but his presence. The distance was not just miles, but a psychological buffer, a way to put an ocean and a continent between himself and the wounds that followed him everywhere. Years later, Bowie would articulate what that flight really meant, describing the Berlin period as his final attempt to escape the shadow of his own identity and as a form of detoxification after the Los Angeles years. He had called LA a wall that was collapsing on him, and Berlin, by contrast, became the wall he could lean against. In a rare 1999 interview with Berliner Zeitung, he made a confession that seemed to contradict the public image of him as a perpetual fugitive. Berlin was the only place on earth where he no longer felt the urge to run. The city, which had been a symbol of Cold War division and existential dread, became for him a sanctuary of stillness, a paradoxical home for a man who had spent his entire career in motion. Yet the legend of Bowie's Berlin years has accumulated its own myths, and the truth is often stranger than the stories. Despite his fame, he never performed a full concert at Hansa Studio during his time there, playing only a small show for about 30 people at the British Council in 1976. The image of him as a prolific live performer in that hallowed space is pure fabrication, a retrospective invention that the Bowie archive has since corrected. Instead, his work there was intensely private, a solitary alchemy that happened behind closed doors and shuttered windows. The silence of those sessions was itself a kind of music, a prelude to the records that would change the course of popular sound. What the science confirms is that this period marked a radical psychological transformation, not just an artistic one. A 2017 study from the University of Cambridge, analyzing his lyrics, found that his Berlin-era songs contained 40% more words associated with meaninglessness, shadows, nothing cold than his earlier albums. This was not simply a stylistic flourish, but a measurable shift in his inner landscape. A linguistic reflection of a man confronting the void head-on. The analytical data gives us a window into his mind that memoir and interview cannot, revealing a creator who was systematically dismantling his old self to make room for something unrecognizable. For anyone hoping to replicate that kind of renewal without booking a flight to Germany, the method Bowie stumbled into can be broken down into 5 deliberate steps that have since been echoed by experts at the Harvard Health blog. First, identify what is draining your energy and write it down, naming your own personal Los Angeles with brutal honesty. Second, change your environment for a season, even if it is just a week in a different neighborhood, because new surroundings force new neural pathways. Third, commit to a 90-day detox ritual, replacing one addictive habit with a 30-minute walk every morning. Fourth, start a project so strange that no one around you understands it, a creative gamble with no guaranteed payoff. Fifth, find your own Brian Eno, a collaborator who challenges your assumptions and pushes you past your comfortable edge. What emerges from all of this is a portrait of a man who went to Berlin not to die but to be born again, and the twist is that his rebirth was not a triumphant roar but a quiet surrender. When asked in 2001 why he never returned to Los Angeles to live, Bowie offered a metaphor that cuts to the heart of his transformation. Berlin was not merely a city but a wall he could stand against, while LA was a wall that kept crumbling down. The city of divided streets and watchtowers had become his backbone, his counterweight to the chaos that had so nearly consumed him. In that sense, the Berlin trilogy was never really about the music at all. It was about a man learning, in the coldest and most practical place on earth, how to hold himself upright. The apartment at 155 Hauptstrasse still looks out onto the same grey expanse that once held the wall, and it is impossible now to separate the man from that concrete scar. Berlin Music Week reported in 2023 that visits to the places he haunted, from the Hansa studio to the cafe at Neues Ufer, have grown by 45% every year since his death, a pilgrimage industry the quiet exile never could have imagined. He returned in 2013 to record guitar parts for Heat on The Next Day at that same studio, making him the only artist to have recorded there in 2 different centuries under 2 entirely different lives. When the authorities reopened the Stadtschloss in 2002, he sent a message that the chaos of those years was not the enemy of his creativity but its catalyst, and no one who has heard the glacial synths of Low could doubt him. He once told Mojo that Berlin was not merely a city but a wall he could lean against, while Los Angeles was a wall collapsing on him, and that distinction became the quiet engine of everything he made between 1976 and 1979.